Hello, everyone. I'm trying out another chair, as you can see. I was sort of hoping that maybe I could find a location where the light didn't reflect quite so much on my glasses. Let me see if I turn my camera just a little bit that way. Is that better? I don't know. I want to be able to wear my glasses so I can see to read better, but I also don't want to be a distraction to you with light reflecting off it. So we'll just see how we get along. Well, today we are starting a new book called Prince Caspian. Now, book number 4 in the Chronicles of Narnia. You remember that yesterday we finished up The Horse and His Boy, and what a lovely and exciting story that was. We learned some new things about Aslan, didn't we, in that story, as well as a little bit of history of Narnia and Arkenland and Calormen and the people that lived in them. But importantly, though, we learned that Aslan is everywhere, that he's behind a lot of the events that took place in the story, wasn't he? He was the one who pushed the little boat ashore so that Arshish could find it and rescue sweet little Shasta, who was really Prince Kor, you remember. But he rescued him and raised him, not very well, but he did keep him alive. And when the time came, Aslan saw to it that Kor came back to Arkenland and rescued them from that crazy, ridiculous Prince Rabbadash, who was bound and determined he was going to conquer Arkenland and then sweep into Narnia and scoop up Princess or Queen Susan and bring her back to Tashbaan as his bride. And we saw how Aslan, or the Lord Jesus, protected Shasta as he was making his way through, and how he punished Aravis for her cruelty to her mother's slave. Lots of different things that we learned about Aslan that maybe we hadn't seen so much in the previous books. But of course, as we know, you can't find out everything there is to know about Aslan or about the Lord Jesus, whom he's a picture of, in just one story. So here we have book number 4, and I'll bet we're going to learn some more things about him in this one. So let's begin. And this book starts off with chapter 1, which is called The Island. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Edmund, Susan, and Lucy, as has been told in another book called, what do you think it is? The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. How they had a remarkable adventure. They had opened the door of a magic wardrobe and found themselves in quite a different world from ours. And in that different world, they had become kings and queens in a country called Narnia. While they were in Narnia, they seemed to reign for years and years. But when they came back through the door, they found themselves in England again, and it seemed to have taken no time at all. At any rate, nobody noticed that they'd been gone, and they never told anyone about it, except one very wise grown-up. And remember who that was? That was Diggory, from the magician's nephew, who was now grown up and a professor, and he owned the house and he owned the wardrobe. And you remember all about how that happened too, don't you? Right. This all happened a year ago, and now all 4 of them were sitting on a seat, on a bench, at a railway station, with their trunks and their suitcases piled up around them. They were, in fact, on their way back to school. They had traveled together as far as this country station, which was a junction. But here, in a few minutes, one train would arrive and take the girls away to their school, and then half an hour later, the boys would go off to another school. And I should just stop and say that I'm going to take my glasses off. That's what I'm going to say. I'm also going to say that back in those days in England, it was very common for families who wanted their children to go to university and do well to send them away to a boarding school, where they would go at the beginning of the fall term and stay there until Christmas, then come home for a little while and then go back again in January and stay until the summer vacation started. And so even from a young age, they generally would stay at home through elementary school. And then as soon as middle school started, like the beginning of maybe 6th grade or even younger sometimes, they would leave and go and live in a boarding school, wear one of those prickly, woolly, scratchy school uniforms, the girls and the boys. And the boys had to wear those high Eton collars. You remember all about those. And not that many people in the general population got to go to university. And if you wanted to get in, it was hard. And if you went to a good school, though, that specially trained you to go to university, you'd have a better chance of getting in. So many parents who could afford it sent their children to boarding school. We don't do that so much anymore, but that's just the way they did it then. And the Pavensi family, who Peter, Edmund, Susan, and Lucy, their parents obviously could afford it, and they're now sending them away to school. The war is over. They come back from living at the professor's house that summer, and now they're back living in London, and they're on their way to boarding school. You got all that straight? Sure you have. Okay. The first part of the journey, when they were all together, always seemed to be part of summer vacation. But now, when they were going to be saying goodbye and going separate ways, everyone felt like the vacation was really over, and everybody felt like the term was beginning again, and they were all rather gloomy, and no one could think of anything to say. Lucy was going to boarding school for the first time. It was an empty, sleepy country station, and there was hardly anyone on the platform except themselves. Suddenly, Lucy gave a sharp little cry, like someone had stung her with a wasp. "What's up, Lou?" said Edmund. And then suddenly he said, "Ow!" "What on earth?" began Peter, but then he, too, suddenly changed what he was going to say, and instead he said, "Susan, let go! What are you doing? Why are you dragging me?" "I'm not touching you," said Susan. "Someone is pulling me. Oh, stop it!" Everyone noticed that all the others' faces had gone very white. "I felt just the same," said Edmund breathlessly, "as if I was being dragged along. That's the most frightful pulling, and I can feel it again." "Me too," said Lucy. "Oh, it's so hard, I can't bear it." "Hey, look sharp," shouted Edmund. "Everybody take hands and stay together. This is magic. I can tell by the feeling. Quick!" "Yes," said the others. So they all held hands, and next moment, the luggage, the seat, the platform, and the station had suddenly vanished. The four children, holding hands and panting, found themselves standing in the middle of a very woody place, so woody that the branches were sticking into them and there was hardly any room. They all rubbed their eyes and took a deep breath. "Oh, Peter," said Lucy, "do you think we possibly could have gotten back into Narnia?" "Well, it could be anywhere," said Peter. "I don't see how we can see a yard in front of us with all these trees. Let's try to get out into some open places, if there are any." So with some difficulty, and with some stings from nettles and pricks from thorns, they struggled out of the thicket. They had another surprise. Everything became much brighter, and after a few steps, they found themselves on the edge of a wood, looking down on a sandy beach. A few yards away, a very calm sea was falling on the sand with such tiny ripples that it hardly made any sound. There was no land in sight and no clouds in the sky. The sun was about where it ought to be at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and the sea was a dazzling blue. They stood sniffing the sea smell. "By Jove," said Peter, "this is good enough." 5 minutes later, everyone was barefoot and wading out into the clear water. "This is better than being stuck on a stuffy train and going back to Latin and French and algebra," said Edmund. And for quite a long time, there was no more talking, only splashing and looking for shrimp and crabs. "All the same," said Susan presently, "I suppose we'll have to make some plans. We shall want something to eat before long." "Well, we've got the sandwiches Mother gave us this morning for the journey," said Edmund. "At least, I've got mine." "Not me," said Lucy. "Mine were in my bag." "And so were mine," said Susan. "Well, mine are in my coat pocket there on the beach. So we've got 2 lunches among 4. That's not going to be much fun." "Well, at present, I want something to drink more than I want something to eat," said Lucy. And everyone now felt very thirsty, as one usually does after wading in salt water for a while. "It's like being shipwrecked," remarked Edmund. "In the books, they always find springs of clear, fresh water on the island. We'd better go and look for them." "Does that mean we have to go back into all that thick wood?" said Susan. Not a bit of it, said Peter. If there are streams, they're bound to go down to the sea, and if we walk along the beach, we're bound to find one there. So they all now waded back and went first across the smooth, wet sand, and then up to the dry, crumbly sand that sticks to one's toes, and began putting on their shoes and socks. Edmund and Lucy wanted to leave them behind and do their exploring with bare feet, but Susan said that would be a crazy thing to do. We might never find them again, she pointed out, and we'll want them again if we're going to be here when night comes and it begins to get cold. When they were dressed again, they set out along the shore, with the sea on their left hand and the wood on their right. Except for an occasional seagull, it was a very quiet place. The wood was so thick and tangled that they could hardly see. They couldn't see into it at all, and nothing in it moved, not a bird, not even an insect. Shells and seaweed and anemones or tiny crabs in rock pools are all very well, but you get tired of them if you're thirsty. The children's feet, after the change from the cool water, became hot and heavy. Susan and Lucy had raincoats to carry. Edmund put his coat down on the bench in the station just before the magic overtook them. But Peter had his overcoat, and so he and Edmund took turns carrying it. Presently, the shore began to curve around to the right. About a quarter of an hour later, after they had crossed a rocky ridge which ran into a point, it made a sharp turn. Their backs were to that part of the sea which had met them when they first came out of the wood, and now, looking around, they could see across the water another shore, thickly wooded, like the one they were exploring. I wonder if this is an island, or do we join on to that mainland presently? I don't know, said Peter, and they all plodded on in silence. The shore that they were walking on drew nearer and nearer to the opposite shore. But as they came around each promontory, the children expected to find a place where the two joined. But in this they were disappointed. They came to some rocks, which they had to climb up, and from the top of the rocks they could see a fair way ahead. And, oh, bother, said Edmund. It's no good. We shan't be able to get to those other woods at all. We are on an island. And it was true. At this point, the channel between them and the opposite shore was only about 30 or 40 yards wide, but they could now see that this was its nearest place. After that, they could see that the coast bent around to the right on their island, and there was open sea beyond it, and the mainland. It was obvious they had already come much more than halfway around the island. And here they are. And you can see that the opposite shore is not too far away, but it's certainly not good if you've got your clothes on. All right. Look, said Lucy suddenly. What's that? And she pointed to a long, silvery, snake-like thing that lay across the beach. A stream! A stream! Shouted the others. And I am sorry, I'm going to have to put my glasses back on. We'll have to figure out what to do. Anyway, you just ignore my reflection in the glasses, and I'll try to read better than I have been reading. Okay. Look, cried Lucy suddenly. What's that? And she pointed to a long, silvery, snake-like thing that lay across the beach. A stream! A stream! Shouted the others. And tired as they were, they lost no time in clattering down the rocks and racing to the fresh water. They knew that the stream would be better to drink further up, away from the beach, so they went at once to the spot where it came out of the wood. The trees were as thick as ever, but the stream had made itself a deep course between the mossy banks, so that by stooping you could follow it up a sort of tunnel of leaves. They dropped to their knees by the first brown pool that they came to and drank, and dipped their faces in the water, and then dipped their arms in up to the elbow. Now, said Edmund, what about those sandwiches? Oh, don't you think we should save them? Said Susan. We may need them far worse later on. I do wish, said Lucy, now that we're not thirsty, that we could go on feeling not hungry as we did when we were thirsty. But what about those sandwiches? Replied Edmund. There's no good saving them till they go bad. You do remember that it's a great deal hotter here than it is in England, and we've been carrying them around in our pockets for hours. So they got out the 2 packets and divided them into 4 portions. And nobody had nearly enough, but it was a great deal better than nothing. Then they talked about their plans for the next meal. Lucy wanted to go back to the sea and catch some shrimp, until someone pointed out that they had no nets. Edmund said that they should gather gulls' eggs from the rocks. But when they came to think of it, they couldn't remember having seen any gulls' eggs, and they wouldn't be able to cook them if they did find any. Peter thought to himself that unless they had some stroke of luck, they would soon be glad enough to eat the eggs raw, but he didn't see any point in saying that right now. Susan said it was a pity they had eaten the sandwiches too soon. 1 or 2 tempers very nearly got lost at this stage, and finally Edmund said, "Look here, there's only one thing to be done. We must explore the wood. Hermits and knights and people like that always manage to live somehow if they're in a forest. They find roots and berries and things." "What sort of roots?" said Susan. "I always thought they meant the roots of trees," said Lucy. "Come on," said Peter. "Ed is right. And we must try to do something, and it'll be better than going out into the glare of the sun again." So they all got up and began to follow the stream. It was very hard work. They had to stoop under the branches and climb over other branches, and they blundered about through great masses of stuff like rhododendrons and tore their clothes and got their feet wet, and still there was no noise at all, except the noise of the stream and the noises they were making themselves. They were beginning to get very tired of it when they noticed a delicious smell, and then a flash of bright color high above them at the top of the right bank. "I say," said Lucy, "I do believe that's an apple tree." It was. They panted up the steep bank, forced their way through some bramble bushes, and found themselves standing around an old tree that was heavy with large golden yellow apples, as firm and juicy as any you ever wished to see. "And this is not the only tree," said Edmund, with his mouth full of apple. "Look, there and there." "Why, there are dozens of them," said Susan, throwing away the core of her first apple and picking up her second. "This must have been an orchard long, long ago, before the place went wild and the wood grew up." "Then this was once an inhabited island," said Peter. "And what's that?" said Lucy, pointing ahead. "By Jove, it's a wall," said Peter, "an old stone wall." Pressing their way between the laden branches, they reached the wall. It was very old and broken down in places, with moss and wildflowers growing all over it, but it was higher than the tallest tree. And when they came quite close to us, they found a great arch, which once must have had a gate in it, but now was almost filled up with the largest of all the apple trees. They had to break some of the branches off to get past, but when they did, they all blinked together in the sunshine because the daylight had suddenly become much brighter. They found themselves in a wide open space. Here's a picture of them in the wide open space, or getting ready to go into it, with the apple trees and the wall up ahead of them. All right, did I read that correctly? Okay. They found themselves in a wide open place with walls all around it, and here there were no trees, only level ground and daisies and ivies and gray walls. It was a bright, secret place, and rather sad, and all 4 stepped out into the middle of it, glad to be able to straighten their backs and move their limbs freely. And that's the end of chapter 1. Let's go on to chapter 2, shall we? This is called The Ancient Treasure House. "This wasn't a garden," said Susan presently. "It was a castle, and this must be the courtyard." "I see what you mean," said Peter. "Yes, that's the remains of a tower, and there is what used to be a flight of stairs going up to the top of the walls. And look at those other steps, the broad, shallow ones going up to that doorway. That must have been the door to the great hall." "Ages and ages ago, by the look of it," said Edmund. "Yes, ages ago," said Peter. I wish we could find out who the people were that lived in this castle and how long ago." "It gives me a queer feeling," said Lucy. "Does it, Lou?" said Peter, turning and looking hard at her. "Because it does the same to me. It's the queerest thing that has happened this queer day, and I wonder where we are and what all this means." While they were talking, they had crossed the courtyard and gone through the other doorway into what had been the hall. This was now very like the courtyard, for the roof had long since disappeared and was merely another space of grass and daisies, except that it was shorter and narrower and the walls were higher. Across the far end there was a kind of terrace about 3 feet higher than the rest. "I wonder, was this really the hall? What is that terrace kind of thing?" said Susan. "Why, you silly," said Peter, who had become strangely excited. "Don't you see? That was where the high table was, where the king and the great lords sat. Anyone would think that you had forgotten that we were once great kings and queens and sat on a dais just like that in our own great hall." "In our castle of Cair Paravel," continued Susan in a dreamy and rather sing-song voice, "at the mouth of the great river of Narnia. How could I forget?" "How it all comes back," said Lucy. "We could pretend we're in Cair Paravel now. This hall must have been very like the great hall we feasted in." "But unfortunately without the feast," said Edmund. "It is getting late, you know. Look how long the shadows are. And have you noticed that it's not so hot anymore?" "We shall need a campfire if we're going to spend the night here," said Peter. "I've got some matches. Let's go and see if we can collect some dry wood." Everyone saw the sense of this, and for the next half hour they were busy. The orchard through which they had first come into the ruins turned out to be not a very good place for firewood. They tried the other side of the castle, passing out of the hall by a little side door into a maze of stony humps and hollows which must have been halls and passages and small rooms, but was now all nettles and wild roses. Beyond this they found a wide gap in the castle wall, and they stepped through it into a wood of darker and bigger trees, where they found dead branches and rotten wood and sticks and dry leaves and pine cones in plenty. They went to and fro with bundles until they had a good pile on the dais. After the 5th journey, they found the well just outside the hall, hidden in weeds, but clean and fresh and deep when they had cleared these away. The remains of a stone pavement round halfway around it. The girls went out to pick up some more apples, and the boys built a fire, fairly close to the corner between 2 walls, which they thought would be the snuggest and warmest place. They had great difficulty in lighting it and used up a lot of matches, but they did succeed in the end. Finally, all 4 sat down with their backs to the wall and their faces to the fire. They tried roasting some of the apples on the ends of sticks, but roast apples are not good without sugar, and they're too hot to eat with your fingers until they're too cold to be worth eating. So they had to content themselves with raw apples, which, as Edmund said, made one realize that school dinners weren't so bad after all. "I wouldn't mind a good thick slice of bread and butter this minute," he added. But the spirit of adventure was rising in them all, and no one really wanted to be back at school. Shortly after the last apple had been eaten, Susan went out to the well to get another drink. When she came back, she was carrying something in her hand. "Look," she said in a rather choking voice. "Look, I found this by the well." And she handed it to Peter and sat down. The others thought she looked and sounded like she might be ready to cry. Edmund and Lucy eagerly bent forward to see what was in Peter's hand, a little bright thing that gleamed in the firelight. "Well, I'm jiggered," said Peter, and his voice also sounded queer. And then he handed it to the others, and now they saw what it was. It was a little chess knight from a chess set, ordinary in size but extraordinarily heavy because it was made of pure gold, and its eyes in the horse's head were 2 tiny rubies, or rather one was, for the other had been knocked out. Why, said Lucy, this is exactly like one of the gold chess pieces that we used to play with when we were kings and queens in Cair Paravel. Cheer up, Sue, said Peter to his other sister. I can't help it, said Susan. It brought back, such lovely times. And I remember playing chess with fauns and good giants and the people singing in the sea and my beautiful horse and now, said Peter in quite a different voice, it's about time we forced it. Have none of you guessed where we are? Said Peter. Go on, said Lucy. I felt for hours that there was some wonderful mystery hanging about this place. Fire ahead, Peter, said Edmund. We're all listening. We are in the ruins of Cair Paravel itself, said Peter. But, I say, replied Edmund, I mean, how do you make that out? This place has been ruined for ages. Those big apple growing roots. Look at stones. Anyone can bet no one has lived here for hundreds of years. I know, said Peter, and that is the difficulty. But let's leave that out for the moment. I want to take the points one by one. First of all, this hall is exactly the same shape and size as the hall at Cair Paravel. Just picture a roof on this, and colored pavement instead of grass, and tapestries on the wall, and you've got our royal banqueting hall. No one said anything. Second point, said Peter. The castle well is exactly where our well was, a little to the south of the great hall, and it's exactly the same size and shape. Again, there was no reply. Third point, Susan has just found one of our old chessmen, or something as like them as two peas. Still, nobody answered. Fourth point, don't you remember? It was the day before the ambassadors came from the king of Calormen. Don't you remember planting the orchard outside the north gate of Cair Paravel? The greatest of all the wood people, Pomona herself came to put good spells on it. It was those very decent little chaps, the moles, who did the actual digging. Can you have forgotten that little old Lily Gloves, the chief mole, leaning on his spade and saying, "Believe me, your majesty, you'll be glad of this fruit one day." And by Jove, he was right. I do, said Lucy and clapped her hands. But look here, Peter, said Edmund. This can't be right. Begin with, we didn't plant the orchard slap up against the gate. We wouldn't have been such fools. No, of course not, said Peter, but it's grown up to the gate since. And for another thing, said Edmund, Cair Paravel wasn't on an island. Yes, I've been wondering about that too, but it was on, a peninsula, jolly nearly an island. Couldn't it have been made into an island? Couldn't it have been made into an island since our time? Maybe someone dug a channel. But half a minute, said Edmund. You keep saying, since our time, but it's only a year ago since we came to Narnia. And you want to make out that in 1 year the castle's fallen down and great forests have grown up and little trees we planted ourselves have turned into a big old orchard and goodness knows what else. It's all just impossible. Well, there's one thing, said Lucy. If this is Cair Paravel, there ought to be a door at the end of the dais. In fact, we ought to be sitting with our backs against it at this moment. You know, the door that led down into the treasure chamber. I suppose there isn't a door, said Peter, getting up, taking up one of the sticks that they had laid ready for putting on the fire. He began beating on the ivy wall. Tap, tap, went the stick against the stone. And then tap, 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 and then boom, boom. Quite a different sound. A hollow wooden sound. Great Scott, said Edmund. We must clear this ivy away. Oh, do let's leave it alone, said Susan. We can try it in the morning. If we've got to spend the night here, I don't want an open door at my back and a great big black hole that anything might come out of, besides the draft and the damp, and soon it'll be dark. Oh, Susan, how can you, said Lucy with a reproachful glance. Both the boys were too excited to take any notice of Susan's advice. They worked at the ivy with their hands and with Peter's pocket knife until his knife broke, and after that they used Edmund's. And soon the whole place where they had been sitting was covered with ivy, and at last they had the door cleared. Locked, of course, said Peter. But the wood's all rotten, said Edmund. We can pull it to bits in no time, and it'll make extra firewood. Come on. It took them longer than they expected, but before they had done, the great hall had grown dusky, and the first star or two had come out. And Susan was not the only one who felt a slight shudder as the boys stood above the pile of splintered wood, rubbing the dirt off their hands and staring into the cold, dark opening they had made. Now for a torch, said Peter. What is the use, said Susan. As Edmund said. I'm not saying it now, said Edmund. I still don't understand, but we can settle that later. I suppose you're coming down, Peter? We must, said Peter. Cheer up, Susan. It's no good behaving like kids now that we're back in Narnia. You're a queen here. And anyway, no one could go to sleep with a mystery like that on their minds. There's the door that they've opened up into the wall. Kind of broken the wood there. They're looking down into a black hole. Wow. They tried to use long sticks as torches, but this was not a success. If you held them with the lighted end up, they went out. And if you held them the other way, they burned your hand and the smoke got in your eyes. In the end, they had to use Edmund's flashlight. Luckily, it had been a birthday present less than a week ago, and the batteries were almost new. He went first with the flashlight. Then came Lucy, then Susan, and Peter was last. I've come to the top of the steps, said Edmund. Count them, said Peter. 1, 2, 3, as Edmund went down, and up to 16. And this is the bottom, he shouted back. This really must be Cair Paravel. There were 16. Nothing more was said until all four were standing in a knot together at the foot of the stairway. Then Edmund flashed his flashlight slowly around. Ooh, said all the children at once. For now, they knew that indeed it was the ancient treasure chamber of Cair Paravel, where they had once reigned as kings and queens of Narnia. There was a kind of path up the middle, and along each side, at intervals, stood rich suits of armor, like knights guarding the treasure. In between the suits of armor, and on each side of the path, were shelves covered with precious things. Bracelets and necklaces and arm rings and finger rings and golden bowls and dishes and long tusks of ivory and brooches and crowns and chains of gold and heaps of unset stones lying around that were some of them as big as some of them were piled up like piles of marbles or potatoes. Diamonds, rubies, carbuncles, emeralds, topazes, and amethysts. Under the shelves stood great chests of oak, strengthened with iron bars and heavily padlocked. And it was bitterly cold. So cold that they could hear themselves breathing. And the treasures were so covered with dust that unless they realized where they were and remembered most of the things, they would hardly even have known that they were treasures. There was something sad and a little bit frightening about the place, because it all seemed so forsaken and so long ago. That was why nobody said anything for a moment. Then, of course, they all began walking about and picking up things to look at. It was like meeting very old friends. If you had been there, you would have heard them saying things like, "Oh, look, our coronation rings. Do you remember first wearing this? Why, this is the little brooch we all thought was lost. Say, isn't that the suit of armor you wore in the great tournament in the Lone Islands? Do you remember the dwarf making this for me? Do you remember drinking out of this horn? Do you remember? But suddenly Edmund said, look here. We mustn't waste the battery on my flashlight. Goodness knows how long we'll need it. Hadn't we better take what we want and get out again? Well, we must take our gifts, said Peter. For long ago, at a Christmas in Narnia, he and Susan and Lucy had been given certain presents, which they valued more than their whole kingdom. Edmund had had no gift because he was not with them at that time. This was his own fault, and you can read about it in the other book. And you know that the other book is The Magician's Nephew. And they all agreed with Peter and walked up the hall, up the path, to the wall at the far end of the treasure chamber. And sure enough, there were their gifts, still hanging. Lucy's was the smallest of all, for it was only a little bottle. But the bottle was made out of diamond instead of glass, and it was still more than half full of the magical cordial that would heal almost every wound and every disease. Lucy said nothing and looked very solemn as she took her gift down from its place and slung the belt over her shoulders, and felt once more the bottle at her side where it used to hang in the old days. Susan's gift had been a bow and arrows and a horn. The bow was still there, and the ivory quiver full of well-feathered arrows, but, "Oh, Susan," said Lucy, "where's the horn?" "Oh, bother, bother, bother," said Susan, as she thought about it for a moment. "I remember now. I took it with me on the last day of all, the day we were going to hunt the white stag. It must have gotten lost when we blundered back into that other place. England, I mean." Edmund whistled. It was indeed a shattering loss, for this was an enchanted horn, and whenever you blew it, certain help came to you, wherever you were. "Just the sort of thing that might come in handy in a place like this," said Edmund. "Never mind," said Susan. "I've still got the bow," and she took it. "Won't the string be perished, Sue?" said Peter. But whether by some magic in the air of the treasure chamber or not, the bow was still in working order. We have 3 children with their gifts. Peter's got his armor and his sword. Susan's got her shield and Lucy's got her sword and shield. Now, who is that? Susan? Is it Susan? No, that must be Edmund I'm sorry, I'm getting mixed up. That's just an empty suit of armor, isn't it? And that's Peter with his shield with line on it, Aslan, and his sword, and Lucy with her little bottle. And we don't see Susan in this picture. Sorry about that. All right. Archery and swimming were the things that Susan was good at, and in a moment she had bent the bow, and then she gave one little pluck to the string. It twanged, a chirping sound that vibrated through the whole room, and that one small noise brought back to the children the whole of the old days, and more than anything that had happened yet. All the battles and hunts and feasts came rushing into their heads together. Then she unstrung the bow again and swung the quiver at her side. Next, Peter took down his gift, the shield with the great red lion on it, and the royal sword. He blew and rapped them on the floor to get off the dust. He fitted the shield onto his arm and slung the sword by his side. He was afraid at first that it might be rusty and stick to the sheath, but it was not so. With one swift motion, he drew it out and held it up, shining in the torchlight. "This is my sword Rinton," he said. "With it I killed the wolf." There was a new tone in his voice, and the others felt that he really was Peter the High King again. And then after a little pause, everyone remembered that they must save the battery in the flashlight. They climbed the stair again and made up a good fire and lay down close together for warmth. The ground was very hard and uncomfortable, but they did fall asleep in the end. That is the end of chapter 2. How do you like this story so far? It sounds like it's going to be a good one, doesn't it? Imagine that. They've come back after all these years. Hundreds and hundreds of years seem to have gone by in Narnia, and yet hardly any time in England. That's the strange thing about Narnia, isn't it? Well, it's been good to be with you again, and I hope I'll see you again next time when we read chapters 3 and 4. Meanwhile, bye for now.